Vietnam. 53, Roger. As a launch alert.
Welcome to Yankee Air Pirates, Naval Aviation in Vietnam, the second episode, Prelude to Tonkin. I'm Tom Carroll, and I'll be your host. Most explanations of the Vietnam War start with the first Gulf of Tonkin incident, August 2nd, 1964. But in reality, that was not the beginning. Naval aviation was already well engaged in the Vietnam theater prior to that. So to understand the story, we have to start left to bang. One note for the hardcore sea dogs, of all episodes, this one will contain a lot of information that is not naval service centric, but it's necessary to cover if one is to perceive the reasons for the war and the way which was fought. Thanks for tuning in, and if you like it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. With World War II over and the tricolor once again flying in Paris, the French joyously celebrated their newfound freedom, and they began to dream of their old Indochina colonial empire. They wanted to bring it back to life, but they found that things had changed. Vietnamese communist nationalists were asserting control throughout Vietnam, and they were ready to fight anyone who would stand in their way. Then, after years of conflict with the Viet Minh, the French were summarily defeated in early 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. Later that year, the Geneva Conference divided Vietnam, with the expectation of a mutually agreed-upon reunification in the near future. The North Division was a Democratic Republic of Vietnam, dominated by the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. North Vietnam received significant support from China and the Soviet Union. The Southern Division was the Republic of Vietnam, notionally with a representative government. It was led by a series of weak leaders, starting with Ngo Dinh Diem, and was supported by the U.S. and much of the free world. Per a 1962 international agreement, Laos, the country directly west of the divided Vietnam, was to be considered neutral by all parties. Yet, with Laos being the primary pathway for North Vietnamese support to insurgents in South Vietnam, the neutrality of Laos was ignored as North Vietnam used it as a logistics pipeline. And in the future, the U.S. would likewise ignore Laos neutrality by attacking that same logistics conduit. The network of roads, trails, and support systems would come to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The domino theory suggested that if one country was allowed to fall to communist aggression, it was likely that other neighboring countries would also become endangered. Thus, in the interest of the entire region, the U.S. believed that it was important to support South Vietnam until it could do so on its own. Nearly 9 years after separation between North and South Vietnam, little headway had been made towards peaceful reunification. In fact, North Vietnam was aggressively working to undermine South Vietnam, as it provided personnel, supplies, and direction to pro-communist insurgents in the South, the Viet Cong. At this point, and under the approval of President John F. Kennedy, the U.S. had 11,000 military advisors in South Vietnam, technically not considered combat forces. With JFK as president, Lyndon Baines Johnson was vice president, and Robert Strange McNamara was Secretary of Defense. JFK didn't trust his military advisors, but did trust his hand-selected civilian ones, called the New Frontiersmen, many of them relatively young and products of East Coast Ivy League universities. LBJ himself, although notionally serving in the military in World War II, was a dyed-in-the-wool politician who had wrangled a commission in the Navy while an elected member of Congress. McNamara had served in the Army Air Force, where his major responsibility had not been combat, but rather the analysis of data related to U.S. bomber effectiveness. Clearly a man of great analytical and management skills, in the end, his effectiveness was undermined by his hubris and inability to understand either the grim nature of war or the iron tenacity of the North Vietnamese leadership. He brought his untempered analytic approach and insistence on data to the Vietnam conflict, which led to the drive for body count and sortie completion numbers, while failing in his fundamental duty to help develop a workable strategy that would lead to success. By 1963, it was clear a better plan was needed for how South Vietnam, with U.S. support, would thwart North Vietnam's aggression and support of the Viet Cong. As the situation deteriorated, Vice President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara and other leaders met in Honolulu in mid-November. A key outcome of the meeting was McNamara ordered an intensified program of action against North Vietnam. Days later, on November 22nd, JFK was assassinated. Within hours, Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States, inheriting the problems of a struggling South Vietnam. In one of his first presidential acts, Johnson ordered a review of the Vietnam situation. His tasker called for a plan with a range of options. As the situation worsened, LBJ was briefed on a new plan, OPLAN 34 Alpha, that would fundamentally be carried out by South Vietnam, but at U.S. direction. The goal was to signal North Vietnamese leadership through gradually increasing military pressure applied in Laos and North Vietnam that the United States would not abide the communist efforts against South Vietnam and Laos. The U.S. would have limited direct involvement and no combat role. Elements of the plan included expanded intelligence collection activities, maritime harassment operations, U-2 strategic missions, electronics intelligence missions, and sabotage operations against 18 targets. Additional provisions were made for possible low-level reconnaissance flights, such as could be conducted by unarmed RF-8 photo crusaders. If approved, these low-level reconnaissance flights would be over Laos, but not North Vietnam. Carrier battle groups were not strangers to operations in waters bordering North and South Vietnam. When operating in the South China Sea, to include the Gulf of Tonkin, the ships and aircraft followed the conventional chain of command, reporting to 7th Fleet as Carrier Task Force 77, or just TF-77. One of the TF-77 missions existing prior to OPLAN 34 Alpha were DeSoto patrols, conducted by specially equipped U.S. destroyers. These destroyers, while overtly conducting freedom of navigation operations in international waters close to countries of interest, to include North Vietnam, also covertly collected and processed various electronics intelligence. On January 16, 1964, LBJ gave the go-ahead for OPLAN 34 Alpha. One of the initial measures, starting in February, was a series of South Vietnamese maritime harassment operations against North Vietnam. Even at the onset, it was clear that the measures of OPLAN 34 Alpha would not be enough to dissuade North Vietnam. In March, CINCPAC staff started developing a more aggressive campaign that included direct U.S. action in the form of a sustained 8-week air campaign. This plan, CINCPAC OPLAN 3764, was published at the end of August, and it included the later-to-be-well-known 94 target list. Potential targets were evaluated for the following possible qualities: reducing North Vietnamese support of operations in South Vietnam and Laos, hindering North Vietnamese ability to take direct action against Laos and South Vietnam, and hindering North Vietnam's ability to function as an industrial state. On May 18th, the Joint Chiefs of Staff activated one of the components of OPLAN 34 Alpha by authorizing Navy and Air Force low-level reconnaissance flights over Laos. These classified operations, which were to receive the name Yankee Team a few days later, were to reveal the extent of enemy infiltration in Laos, to provide intelligence for military and political planning, and to demonstrate U.S. presence and commitment. Initially, the flights were reconnaissance only, no return of hostile fire allowed. One of the first Navy Yankee Team operations took place on May 21st by 2 RF-8A photo crusaders from Kitty Hawk. The photo recon crews in their briefing were told about a group called Air America that operated logistics flights in Laos for the U.S. government, and that should the worst happen, Air America might provide assistance. It was not entirely clear to all the aviators at the time, but in reality, Air America worked directly for the CIA. The reconnaissance mission was led by Lieutenant Commander Ben Cloud, the officer in charge of the VFP 63 detachment on Kitty Hawk, with Lieutenant Charles Klusman as his wingman. Over the objective area in Laos, Cloud saw ground fire being directed at them and radioed for Klusman to maneuver. Klusman saw the tracers and white puffs around his aircraft, and then cockpit warning lights illuminated, indicating vital systems had been hit. Looking outside, he saw fuel pouring from his left wing. Once clear of the area, he saw his wing was on fire. To starve the fire of oxygen, but also to make his remaining fuel last, it was vital to climb to the highest altitude possible. Reaching 40,000 feet 20 minutes later, the fire went out. But all was not okay. The aircraft was shedding parts. They finally made it back to the Kitty Hawk, and upon landing, Klusman shut down with less than 600 pounds of fuel. The next day, in a demonstration of the organizational flexibility of the Naval Aviation Team, the Marine Corps added 5 additional RF-8s with Marine aviators, all junior officers, to the Kitty Hawk reconnaissance team. Yankee Team missions continued to be conducted both day and night, and despite pleas from the units conducting the flights, no armed escorts would be allowed, at least not yet. On June 6, pilots from Kitty Hawk would make one of its last Yankee Team reconnaissance missions before completing its long deployment and heading home. Klusman, who had now flown multiple Yankee Team missions during which his aircraft had been damaged by AAA on 3 occasions, would lead this last mission with Lieutenant Jerry Kuchman as wingman. Over the target area, Klusman was, almost not surprisingly, hit again, and this time he knew it was more serious than the previous events. Within 2 minutes, the aircraft controls had become unresponsive, and in Klusman's words, it was time to get out and walk. The ejection worked as advertised. Shortly after hitting the ground, he saw an Air America prop aircraft making low passes. Armed rescue aircraft were launched from Kitty Hawk, but up the chain of command, the order was given for them to be recalled. No American military forces would be allowed to rescue the pilot. Word of this quickly reached the SINCPAC duty officer Glenn Tierney, a Navy pilot assigned to the staff. He was told the order included direction not to use 2 Air America helicopters that were only 20 miles away from Klusman. Tierney knew that refusing to help a downed pilot was something his Navy superiors would not condone. Bypassing 3 flag officers, he soon had the commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific, Admiral Felt, in the command center with him. Tierney had been right, and Felt soon had Secretary of Defense McNamara on the line. When McNamara explained that he and the Secretary of State had made the decision of no rescue, Admiral Felt coolly told him that this was not a decision he could make and asked for the president. When the president was reached and the situation explained, he said, "Well, I'll be damned. Of course, go in and get them, and let me know how it works out." Attempts were made to bring in rescue helicopters. The first one encountered intense ground fire, and the co-pilot was shot in the head. A second attempt was made, but the rescue window of opportunity had been missed. Before long, Klusman was a prisoner of the Communist Pathet Lao, the first American aviator taken prisoner in what would be a long conflict. The day after Klusman's shootdown, the JCS relented and approved armed escort aircraft for the reconnaissance missions. On June 7th, the Pathet Lao downed the F-8 Crusader of Commander Doyle Lynn, commanding officer of VF-111 on Kitty Hawk, as he flew armed escort for the recon aircraft. The Pathet Lao has shot down 2 aircraft within days. Although ejecting in the same area Klusman had gone down, Lynn was able to evade capture, and the next day was rescued, shown here, exiting the rescue helicopter. Yankee Team operations were temporarily called off to assess the situation. When the Navy resumed Yankee Team missions on June 14th, reconnaissance flights were conducted from a higher altitude and away from the more lethal areas of Laos. These steps limited aircraft losses, but also muted the intended message of U.S. resolve and lessened the quality of intelligence. Crusaders, Sky Warriors, and the newly deployed RA-5C Vigilantes carried out the aerial reconnaissance of Laos from carriers stationed at the soon-to-be-famous Yankee Station in the South China Sea. Although a prisoner, Klusman's story was not yet over. Interrogated nearly daily and sick, he lost nearly 50 pounds, but he was nonetheless determined to escape. After 86 days in captivity, he joined other prisoners in an escape, and after 2 days evading his pursuers through leech-infested jungles, Klusman and another prisoner, Boon Mi, made it to friendly forces. Yankee Team missions would continue, and in the coming months, the conflict would escalate to direct armed combat at sea.